Allah Yahweh Shemel Shai. Yahweh Shemel Shai. Barakatah Yahweh Shai. Barakatah Yahweh. Barakatah Yahweh. Barakatah Yahweh Shai.
And I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns, and he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God.
The Israelites told me this day would come. I didn't listen.
Oh my God!
What is that thing? And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble. And they shall kindle in them, and devour them, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord hath spoken it.
Barakatah Yahweh Shai. Barakatah Yahweh. Barakatah Yahweh. Barakatah Yahweh Shai.
All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I would like to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai Bahashem, Rakakadash. Double honors unto the apostles and the elders of GMS who rule well, teach well, being great examples to his younger brothers, and peace and blessings and salutation to the hopeful elect out there pushing his word and truth. And it's a series across the four winds in the name of Yahweh Bahashem, Yahweh Shai Bahashem, Rakakadash. Pushing to get up out of here. Shalom to the hopeful leg, the believers, the listeners who have came back to the obedience of the scriptures through faith in Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. All right. And what I want to go into in this live stream is he, all right, can never be satisfied. And this is Esau Edom, you know, and what I want to do is go into some history, because we have to understand with these Edomites, you know, they do the same thing over and over again, you know, and that's fight over their own powers, their own power structure. Okay, when they are the dominant nation, okay, in the world, when they're the superpower in the world, they always fight over their own empire. And what we're seeing today is no different. Okay, because the devil, you know, he can never be satisfied. You know, there's no amount of power, there's no amount of wealth that will satisfy this nigga. Okay, he would always want more. All right, and they would always be in competition with one another, okay, while they're ruling. You see? So these devils, all right, they always collapse, all right, their own empire with infighting, okay, and there's no different than what we see today, all right, because you really go into why these devils are at odds with each other and why these nations are at odds with each other. It really doesn't make any sense unless you factor until you factor in greed, and that this nigga can never be satisfied, man. Okay, that's why it's not meant for this man, all right, to be in power, but for a moment, as the scriptures speak about. So let's go here, and I got a pretty good clip I found, pretty good little documentary, short documentary dealing with Napoleon, you know, and Napoleon, which was this French, all right, emperor / general, okay, became too greedy, okay, and these devils, you know, they deal treacherously with one another. So let's go and let's get into some precepts precepts, and then we'll go into it. All right, this is the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, and verse 9. All right, in the NLT, it says history merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. You know, nothing under the sun is truly new. So what we see playing out in the earth, these things have been before. All right, and that's why it's good to go into history, because you see the same patterns. You know, and history tells a story, all right, that lines up with prophecy of where things are headed. Okay, you know, so what we're seeing is these devils. You know, they do the same thing. That's why you can go into the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Greek Empire. Okay, the fall of the British Empire. It's the same pattern. Okay, these devils, they get too ambitions. All right, their resources and their capability, all right, don't match their ambitions. Okay, and they all do overreach until they're destroyed. Okay, so let's go from there. Let's get this. Let's go to the book of Habakkuk. All right, which is the basis of, you know, this lesson. So you go here to the book of it's the book of Habakkuk. All right, chapter 2. This book, Habakkuk 2 and 4, said, behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just. Okay, and it's the elect of Israel shall live by faith. And our faith is that this man is going to be overthrown. All right, the Heavenly Father is going to put this man down once and for all. Okay, as we see this man, you know, operates, you know, very treacherous, very wickedly, okay, very, very violently, very unjustly in the earth. Okay, the scriptures say his soul, all right. So the Esau spirit is not upright in him. Esau just not right. This ism, that ism, you know, this economy style and this, you know, none of that matter. He not right. Okay, it won't matter what style government, Republican, Democrat. Okay, it won't matter what style government you put in. Okay, this nigga ain't right. Okay, and that's why the Lord is finna transition the kingdom from one people, all right, these Edomites, to another, which is Jacob, beginning with Yahushua, the first fruits, and the rest of the elect, man. All right, men, women, and children who are predestined for salvation. Okay, Habakkuk 2 and 5. Yeah, also because he transgressed by wine, he is a proud man, and he drunk off greed. Okay, he's drunk off power. He's drunk off violence. Okay, he's drunk off wealth, man. And he's become a proud man. So what we're seeing with Esau is like a drunk man staggering around the earth. Okay, trying to you know, expand his power. Okay, and that's why this man is going to go out very tacky. Okay, because he's drunk off pride and his decision making is through. You see, it says, neither keep it at home who enlarges his desires hell and is as death and cannot be satisfied, but gather unto him all nations and heaping unto him all people. Okay, gathering unto himself all nations and heaping unto himself all people. And this is what this man has done. All right, this man has got a foothold, okay, in all these different governments of the world. Okay, this man has turned the planet Earth into a slave camp, man. You see, and it's to the point now that he wants to put a device in everyone, merge everyone with his technology, and have another level of control. You see, it says, and cannot be satisfied, but gather unto him all nations and heap it unto him all people. And that's the point. This man can never be satisfied. It'll never be enough for this nigga, man. You know, if he was able to establish his new world order, okay, and, you know, run that system for a while, well, he would come up with something else that would give him even more control. He would never stop trying to get more control, more wealth, more power, more influence. He would never stop. Okay, he can never be satisfied, and it makes him an unfit ruler. Okay. Habakkuk 2 and 6, it says, shall not all these take up a parable against him? And this happens every time, even amongst themselves. All right. Because World War III, it's gonna be a lot of Edomite governments fighting Edomite governments, man. The EU going against the small hats in America. Okay, Russia going against America. You see, even Turkey. All right. They're Islamic, but those a lot of Edomites in Turkey, man. Going back to the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So even when you go, you're gonna have other heathens, Iran or Elam, all right, those Ishmaelites, okay, Moab, Ammon, okay, even a few Hamitic nations, all right, they're gonna be with Russia, okay, but ultimately, all right, these devils, they even rise up against themselves, man, especially when there's one, all right, government, you see, amongst these devils that rise up and begin to dominate. All right, eventually they take up a taunting proverb against him, man. And that's what we're seeing, like, well, with America. You have other Edomite nations and, all right, heathen nation is rising up against, okay, the whore, okay. And it says, woe to him that increases that which is not his. And that's all America does is go and takes what's not theirs. Their whole foreign policy is jack boy. They're just really jack boys in suits. That's their foreign policy, nigga. We come to take it. Okay? For the longest they've been, political with it and being able to, talk in a certain way as if, they're the heroes of humanity. Okay? But on the guys like Trump, which we understand he's a puppet, he's just the face, the logo. Okay, but he expresses what it really is. Okay, Trump is just expressing what's really been going on this whole time. All right, he just more blatant with it. Okay, because American foreign policy is, nigga, we just gonna come take it, nigga, do something. Okay, and now they got to the point to where they can't take anymore. These nations that taunting proverb, okay, is beginning to speak against this devil, man. Okay, Iran told that nigga will take what? Okay, now things are shifting. You see, because it's the end of Esau and it's the end of all these heathens having authority in the earth, man. Okay, all authority is finna be put down. Okay, but it begins with Esau imploding on his own damn self, man. Okay, it says, woe to him that increases that which is not his. How long unto him that ladeth himself with thick clay? Shall not they rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for booties unto them, which is a spoil unto them. All right, and the Lord is going to allow these nations, okay, to spoil America, man, through war. Okay, that even as we speak now, all right, that money, all right, that America used to make through the Strait of Hormuz, because America makes a lot of money through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, because they know those GCC nations, all right, were nothing but prop states, okay, propped up countries, all right, and there was a extortion. America extorted, okay, because America established, all that their oil, all right, production capability. That's Esau money that he put into that. He just allowed those Arabs, okay, to get wealthy on kickback, okay. But ultimately, that's America that makes a lot of money, okay. And America, bankers, okay, and investors that make their money off their oil that come through the Strait, okay. But now Iran is beginning to tax and impose a toll on the Strait of Hormuz, so they're already beginning to spoil America, man. Okay, that's a spoil of war, all right, that America has lost. Okay, there used to be American revenue. There used to be, European revenue that come through, mainly British and America, that established those GCC nations, set up those all right, those certain kings, in their region, you know, set up in certain dynasties in their region, okay, that allowed America and the British to get a cut off all that oil that was coming through. Now, Iran is getting a cut off their oil, and they choosing what go through, okay, and Russia is making a killing in this whole process, man. So this place is already beginning to be spoiled. Okay, and just gonna get worse, man. And it's gonna be short lived because Yahweh Shai gonna come and clear out everybody. Okay, but we're seeing these things happen. Okay, and it's always the same build up as we're gonna go into this. I'm gonna go into this video. It says, shall not they rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be booty for them, because thou hast spoiled many nations. All the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's bloods, and for the violence of the land of the city, and all of all that dwell therein. Yeah, man. So, America just been, the dominant war machine. Okay, it's just been the dominant war machine. All right, that just has been going through the earth. All right, shedding blood and stealing. Okay, and it's a lot of civilians that American military, all right, has killed, man. You see, on their conquest for empire. All right, and that's why the Lord is going to allow, all right, all the inhabitants of Babylon, okay, to be put to death, man. Okay, to be unalive. Okay, at the climax of this war. You see, there's going to be America reaping what is sown throughout the earth. Okay, and it all right begins with this devil can never be satisfied, man. His ambition, okay, is going to kill billions, man. This man's ambition, okay, it's going to go bad at the end. So let's go here. Let's get the video. You're going to see a lot of similarity to what's going on. Just picture the French, okay, under Napoleon is like, that's the position America is in at this point, okay? And then you're going to see how, also get a glimpse of how the elites, all right, manipulate these wars, okay? They do money grabs, which now, because in this time, in 1800s, early 1800s, okay, the elites, they use this war as a money grab, okay? They became extremely wealthy off of this war, okay? But now they're in a position now to where they want power. They let, Trump them, in that tier, all right, of Edomites do the money grab. And the elites, they want a control system set up as a result of this war, which is going to fail. Okay, so let's play this.
The year is 1806, and the map of Europe has been redrawn by the sword of one man. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, stands at the absolute zenith of his power. He has crushed the Austrian Empire at Austerlitz. He has humiliated the Prussians at Jena. His armies have marched through the gates of Vienna and Berlin, and his brothers sit on the thrones of half the continent. To the observer standing on the bloody fields of Central Europe, it seems as though the war is over. The French eagle flies from the Atlantic to the Rhine. But Napoleon knew the truth. He knew that his victory was an illusion as long as one enemy remained standing. Just 20 miles across the English Channel, the island of Great Britain remained defiant. Napoleon could conquer every capital in Europe, but he could not cross that narrow strip of water. The Royal Navy stood like a wall of oak and iron between the Grand Army and the white cliffs of Dover. The Battle of Trafalgar the previous year had destroyed the French fleet and ended any dream of a military invasion. The Emperor was trapped on the land. He was a lion who could not swim, and his enemy was a shark who could not walk. The stalemate drove Napoleon to a realization that would change the course of history. He realized that he could not defeat Britain with cannons and cavalry. He had to find another way. He looked at his enemy and he saw something that he despised, but also secretly respected.
So you see Napoleon, all right, he had all this power, this wealth, he was dominating most of Europe, okay, but it was one, okay, Edomite government, the British, okay, that he didn't have in subjection. Okay, and they play, and then, you know, they vexed him, man. The nigga just ain't right. Nigga couldn't sit down and just run Europe. Why not? This is your fellow Edomite. Why not just have a friendly relationship and y'all just run shit together? Okay, Esau can't do that. It's a zero-sum game with these devils. You know, this is beautiful how it paused right here. Okay, because he's looking at the guy that runs Britain. I believe it's Lord Willingham at this time. All right, but you see the face-off, and that's what these nations are doing right now. All right, this is how these Edomites are looking at each other right now. This is how Russia is looking at America. This is how EU looking at, all right, America and Russia. This is how, okay, Turkey is looking at, all right, the small hats in America. All right, they can't just run the earth. Here is the Edomite. The earth is giving it to his hands, and they can't just have friendly relations with one another. They got to have all this treachery going on, man. Okay. Like, if Napoleon would just set his ass down, he would have been good. Okay? But it's not in them devils to do that. The soul which is lifted up in him is not upright. They do the same. They get proud. Okay? You're going to keep going through history and showing you these devils do the same thing every time, man. They get proud. Okay? And they want everything. Once they take the earth, once Esau has the earth in his control, okay, they fight each other every time. This going back to the 1800s. You're going to keep showing the same pattern in history with these devils, man. Okay?
He saw that Britain was not a warrior nation in the traditional sense. It was a commercial nation. He famously dismissed them as a nation of shopkeepers. He believed that their power did not come from the bravery of their soldiers, but from the gold in their banks and the goods in their warehouses. He believed that the British economy was a house of cards held up by global trade. If he could pull out the bottom card, the whole structure would collapse. If he could stop the shopkeepers from selling their goods, they would go bankrupt. If they went bankrupt, they could not pay their sailors. They could not subsidize the armies of Russia and Austria. The war would end not with a bang, but with a bounced check. And so in November of 1806, sitting in the captured palace of the Prussian king in Berlin, Napoleon took up his pen and signed the Berlin Decree. It was a declaration of total economic war. With a stroke of ink, he declared that the British Isles were in a state of blockade. This was an audacious claim because Napoleon had no ships to enforce a blockade. Usually a blockade means surrounding a port with battleships, so nothing can get out. Napoleon decided to invert the very concept of a blockade. He would not block the British ports from the outside. He would block the European ports from the inside. He declared that no ship coming from Britain or its colonies would be allowed to enter any port under French control. He declared that all trade with Britain was illegal. All British goods found on the continent were to be seized and burned. All British subjects found in French lands were to be arrested. He called this the Continental System. It was a plan to turn the entire continent of Europe into a fortress hermetically sealed against British trade. The logic was ruthless. Europe was Britain's biggest customer. If Napoleon could close the door to that market, the factories in Manchester and Birmingham would have nowhere to send their cotton and iron. The warehouses in London would overflow with unsold stock. Unemployment would skyrocket. The British people would riot. The government would fall. It was a siege not of a city, but of an entire economy. Napoleon sent orders to his generals and customs officers across the empire. They were to patrol the coastlines from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. They were to search every ship and every wagon. The war had moved from the battlefield to the custom house, but the British government was not about to sit idly by and watch their economy be strangled. They were the masters of the sea, and they decided to fight fire with fire. They issued the orders in council. This was a counter-blockade that was even more aggressive than Napoleon's. The British government declared that if Europe would not trade with them, then Europe would not trade with anyone. The Royal Navy established a blockade of the entire French Empire. They told the neutral nations of the world, like the United States, that if they wanted to sail to France, they had to stop in a British port first. They had to pay a tax and get a license. Britain was effectively saying that they owned the oceans.
All right, and you see that similar thing happening with Iran. So Iran, you know, they're using the tactic of controlling the waters. Okay, in America, all right, what have they been fighting Iran with? Sanctions. Okay, so the French, you know, they pretty much put sanctions, okay, on British, all right, on the British, okay, and British, all right, they began to control the actual waterways, okay, and did a blockade. Like Iran, they have a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, okay, and they're charging a toll, okay, for any nation that wants their oil to come out of the Strait of Hormuz. You see? So you see how war repeats itself. Like that's why I say these tactics that we see, dealing with war, all right, these are actually war tactics. The elites, they manipulate things, but when they don't, all right, they don't strategize the actual war. Okay, they manipulate the economy in the background, which is going to go into that as well. Okay, but they don't strategize and come up with the battlefield outcomes. Okay. Tactics, all right, going on today. Okay. So just like the French, they put sanctions on the British, and the British responded with what? A naval blockade. Okay. I'm like, man, this is exactly what's going on today. Okay. And I'm praying that it's linking up and making sense. But let's play this some more.
If you wanted to sail on their water, you had to pay their toll. This created a chaotic reality for the merchants of the world. A ship captain sailing from New York to Hamburg was trapped between two giants. If he obeyed the British and stopped in London, Napoleon would seize his ship when he arrived in Hamburg. If he obeyed Napoleon and ignored the British, the Royal Navy would capture him at sea. Legal trade became almost impossible. The price of goods skyrocketed. Coffee, sugar, and tobacco became luxury items that only the rich could afford. The people of Europe who had grown used to these colonial goods began to grumble. Napoleon had promised them glory, but now he was taking away their morning coffee. However, Napoleon had underestimated two things. He had underestimated the resilience of the British economy, and he had underestimated the power of greed.
So just like today, these nations are being faced to decide, well, are we going to keep trying to deal with America? Okay, because if you deal with America, it was a time dealing with America was the best option economically and militarily in the earth. That was the best alliance you could have was the American alliance, security guarantees, all right, and economic, opportunities. Okay. But now Iran has made it very difficult to remain an American ally. All right. Because if you choose America, your oil is held hostage. Okay. And if you try to help America militarily, you get hit. Okay, so these nations are being forced to decide between America or Iran. Okay, and we're seeing a lot of nations begin to tiptoe over to Iran and make deals. Okay, so it's the same thing. You had that back then. You had to decide between the French or the British. Okay, so let's play this a little more.
As soon as the legal channels of trade were closed, a massive underground network of smuggling sprang to life. It was the golden age of the smuggler. The British government, knowing they could not force their way into the ports, established offshore bases. The most famous was the island of Heligoland. It was a tiny barren rock in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark. The British seized it and turned it into a giant warehouse. It was like a supermarket for smugglers. British merchant ships would unload millions of pounds worth of cotton and sugar on the island. Then, under the cover of darkness, hundreds of small fishing boats would row out from the German and Dutch coasts. They would buy the goods with gold and row them back to the mainland. The French customs officers were overwhelmed. The coastline of Europe is thousands of miles long. It is full of hidden coves and inlets. Napoleon could not put a soldier on every beach. And even when he did, the soldiers were often corrupt. The bribes that the smugglers could offer were huge. A French customs officer who earned a few francs a day could make a year's salary by looking the other way for 5 minutes. The corruption went all the way to the top. One of Napoleon's own marshals, Massena, was rumored to be making a fortune selling trading licenses. Even the Empress Josephine Napoleon's own wife continued to buy British muslins and goods because she preferred them to the French alternatives. The most ironic example of this failure occurred in 1812. Napoleon was preparing for his massive invasion of Russia. He needed to equip an army of 600,000 men. He needed hundreds of thousands of pairs of boots and greatcoats. The French textile industry, which Napoleon was trying to protect, was too slow and inefficient to produce them. The quality was poor and the price was high. The emperor's quartermasters faced a dilemma. They could either send the soldiers into the Russian winter barefoot, or they could deal with the enemy. In a secret transaction that highlights the absurdity of the continental system, the French army purchased thousands of boots and coats from British manufacturers. The transaction was approved by the British government. They reasoned that if Napoleon wanted to pay them gold, they would take it. They knew that gold was more valuable to the war effort than boots were to the French soldiers. So the Grand Army marched to Moscow wearing boots made in Northampton and coats woven in Yorkshire.
So you see how, because when you look into Napoleon, when you study Napoleon, he was a military genius. You know, he was a strategic genius when it came to military strategy. Okay, but you see how his greed has him moving very foolish, man. Okay, because here it is, his whole thing was to put a blockade and choke out the British economy, but he choked out his own economy. Okay, but this is ambition. This is all ambitions. Okay, and this is what Esau was at now. All right, his ambition has him moving very foolishly, man. It don't make sense. Like, that's why you really look at him. People think, well, oh, this is some type of grand master plan by the elites, some type of grand master plan by America. See, America really win, you know, if you carry the 5 and you cross the T, and no, nigga, this is stupid what they're doing. All right, this is ambition and greed, and it's dumb. Okay, we're going back to the point. Here it is. Napoleon, his whole thing was to choke out the British economy. All right, but he began to choke out his own economy. Okay, and then he had to he had to purchase boots from British, all right, manufacturing, man, to try to go invade Russia in the winter. Nigga. Okay, so when you see these Edomites moving recklessly and you're scratching your head like, nigga, what are y'all doing? This is his ambition. This is how Edomite operates when he, is when he gets to a certain level of power. Okay, his ambition overrides logic. Okay, this is stupid what Napoleon is doing, but it's ambition. This is all ambition. Logic is out the window. Just like today, Esau New World Order is all ambition. Logic is out the window. Okay, so let's play this some more.
But while the smugglers and the secret deals kept the goods flowing, the economic strain was real. The continental system was not just hurting Britain, it was hurting Europe. The port cities of France and Holland were dying. Amsterdam, Bordeaux, and Marseille had built their wealth on shipping. Now their ships rotted at the docks. Grass grew in the streets. The merchant classes who had supported the revolution were facing ruin. They blamed Napoleon. The emperor was sacrificing their livelihoods for a war that seemed to have no end. The system also required Napoleon to constantly expand his empire. This is a crucial point. A blockade is only as strong as its weakest link. If one country in Europe allowed British goods, and those goods would flood across the borders and undermine the whole system. Napoleon became obsessed with plugging the leaks. This obsession drew him into conflicts that he did not need. It was the reason he invaded Portugal. Portugal was an old ally of Britain and refused to close its ports. So Napoleon sent an army through Spain to occupy Lisbon. This triggered the Peninsular War. The French army found itself bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war in Spain that lasted for years. It drained Napoleon of men and money. He called it his Spanish ulcer, and he caught this ulcer because he was trying to enforce the continental system. He bullied his allies. He forced his brother Louis, the King of Holland, to abdicate because Louis refused to crack down on his own subjects for smuggling.
Does this sound familiar? Wars that don't end, wars they don't need. Okay, that only hurts their own people. Does this sound familiar? Okay, how America is operating. The same things that are being echoed about America today. Never-ending wars that they don't need, wars that don't make sense for the American people. Okay, Napoleon was doing the same thing. Ambition. Okay, let's play this.
Napoleon annexed Holland directly into France just so he could send his own customs officers to patrol the Dutch canals. He was cannibalizing his own family and his own alliances to sustain the economic war. He was turning every nation in Europe against him. He was no longer the liberator who brought the Napoleonic code and modern laws. He was the tyrant who made bread expensive and destroyed trade. At the center of this financial war was a family that would become legendary, the Rothschilds. Nathan Mayer Rothschild was based in London, and his brother James was in Paris. They operated a banking network that defied the blockade. They had their own fast boats and their own couriers. They moved gold across the channel right under Napoleon's nose. In fact, the French banking system was so underdeveloped compared to the British that Napoleon's own government sometimes unknowingly used the Rothschild network to transfer funds. The British government used the Rothschilds to send gold to the Duke of Wellington, who was fighting Napoleon's armies in Spain. It is a staggering thought. The gold to pay the British soldiers fighting the French was being smuggled through France itself by bankers who were operating in both capitals. As we reach the end of the first part of this story, the stage is set for a cataclysm.
So you see how the elites play both sides. Okay. And this is what the elites do. All right. They don't give a damn about the French or the British. Okay. They just want to emerge at the end of the war with both governments in debt to them. Okay. The elites, even now, their whole thing now is to get Iran in debt with them. Okay. Because all these other nations, these other superpowers, okay, they're in debt to these elite bankers already. Okay. Now they need Iran to be in debt to them. All right. So they don't care about, the elites don't care about Iran kicking the small hats and America ass, man. They play the back, and their objective is to put these nations in debt. Okay. Because if they're in debt to the bankers, okay, then the bankers run their governments, man. Okay. You see, and this is how these devils, these elites have always got down in the background. They let these nations tear each other head off. They sit back. Okay. And then they began to manipulate the war as it goes to benefit their agenda of more control. Okay. So you had James Rothschild funding the French, and you had Nathaniel Rothschild funding the British. And when it got to a certain point, and they see that British, okay, a British victory, okay, will be more beneficial to their agenda, they stopped funding the French, all right, and they began to put more money behind the British. Okay, so let's let this play.
The continental system has turned Europe into a pressure cooker. Britain is suffering. There are riots in the industrial towns of England. Banks are failing. But Britain is holding on. The Royal Navy ensures that while they cannot sell to Europe easily, they can sell to the rest of the world. They are opening new markets in South America and Asia. Meanwhile, the pressure inside Napoleon's empire is reaching the breaking point. The Tsar of Russia is looking at his ruined economy and realizing he has a choice to make. He can obey Napoleon and let his country starve, or he can open his ports and face the wrath of the emperor. The economic war is about to turn into a shooting war on a scale the world has never seen. The blockade that was designed to destroy Britain is about to destroy the man who built it. By the year 1810, the continental system was tearing the alliance between France and Russia apart. Tsar Alexander I had joined the blockade after the Treaty of Tilsit, believing it would bring peace and partnership with Napoleon. But the economic reality for Russia was catastrophic. Russia was an agrarian economy. Its wealth came from exporting raw materials like timber, hemp, grain, and tallow. Its biggest and most reliable customer had always been Great Britain. When the Tsar closed the ports to British ships, he effectively shut down the Russian economy. The Russian nobility who owned the forests and the fields saw their income evaporate. The value of the Russian ruble collapsed, losing half its value in just a few years. The cost of luxury goods imported from France skyrocketed. The Russian aristocracy felt like they were paying a tribute to Paris while getting nothing in return. Alexander was in a precarious position. His father, the previous Tsar, had been assassinated by his own courtiers in part because his foreign policy hurt Russian trade. Alexander feared that if he continued to enforce Napoleon's blockade, he would meet the same fate. He tried to compromise. He issued decrees that made it difficult to import French luxury goods, effectively placing a tariff on his ally. At the same time, he began to turn a blind eye to neutral American ships entering Russian ports. Everyone knew these American ships were often carrying British cargoes, but Alexander needed the trade. Napoleon saw this as a personal betrayal. He had a binary view of the world. You were either with him or against him. He wrote furious letters to the Tsar lecturing him on the importance of the system. He believed that if Russia was allowed to cheat, the whole blockade would crumble. Other nations would follow suit, and the British would win. Napoleon felt he had to make an example of Russia. He had to force them back into the system at gunpoint. This is the great tragedy of the invasion of 1812. It was not a war for territory. Napoleon did not want to rule Moscow. He did not want to annex the Russian steppes. He invaded Russia simply to force the Tsar to close his ports. It was a police action carried out by 600,000 soldiers. It was a war fought for a trade embargo. In June of 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River. It was the largest military force ever assembled in European history up to that point. It was a multinational army with soldiers from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and a dozen other nations. They were all marching to enforce the will of the emperor. But as they marched east, something happened that Napoleon had not predicted. The moment his back was turned, the continental system began to collapse in his rear. With the French army occupied in the depths of Russia, the enforcement of the blockade in the north loosened. British goods began to pour into the Baltic ports. The smugglers became bolder. The very thing Napoleon went to war to prevent was happening because he went to war. The disaster of the Russian campaign is well known. The burning of Moscow, the retreat through the snow, the freezing to death of hundreds of thousands of men. But while the human toll was horrific, the economic consequence was the final nail in the coffin of the French Empire. As the shattered remnants of the Grand Army stumbled out of Russia, the fear of Napoleon evaporated. The nations of Europe, which had been suffering under the economic stranglehold, saw their chance.
It's the same thing that's happening to America. As America's trying to go to war with every goddamn body. Okay. You see? Same thing is happening to America, man. Especially with this last, all right, this last 40 days, you know, of war that they've had with Iran. Well, you're seeing the fear that these nations have for the American empire is falling. Because you had Napoleon, here it is, you know, his blockade on British goods, all right, was supposed to break the British economy. It was doing the exact opposite. Okay. So now he tries to go to war with Russia in the middle, just like America. He got too much shit going on. He's trying to go to war with Russia. He's trying to block. You see how Esau's ambition, okay, goes beyond his capability, just to sum it up and keep it short. Napoleon's ambition went beyond his capability. Okay, in his mind, he just gonna go force Moscow to do what he want them to do, force Russia to do what he want to do, and you put all those troops in the middle of Russia, in the middle of winter, because of what? Ambition. Okay, and this is the war that ended, all right, the French Empire. Okay, and it all was based off the ambition of one man. Okay, and you see how America is moving. Okay, they're trying to put, you know, blockades here, Cuba, Greenland, you know, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Ukraine. They're trying to do too goddamn much. Okay, they're stretched thin. All right, and they're not as effective as they once were. And now with this last war, and now with this war, this current war with Iran, okay, these nations are starting to look at America like, nigga, you see? So that fear that Napoleon once had is falling. We see it falling off, and that fear that America once had, we see it falling off, overstretched, doing too much. Okay, so let's play this.
Prussia rose up. Sweden joined the coalition. Austria mobilized. They were fighting for their national independence, but they were also fighting for their economic survival. They wanted to be part of the global economy again. They wanted British subsidies and British markets. The final campaigns of 1813 and 1814 were fueled by British gold. The British government, having survived the scare of the blockade, poured money into the coffers of Napoleon's enemies. They sent millions of pounds to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They sent muskets and gunpowder and uniforms. The wealth that the continental system had failed to destroy was now weaponized to destroy its creator. At the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Europe. He was defeated not just by superior numbers, but by the collective exhaustion of a continent that was tired of his economic experiments. When the Allies finally marched into Paris in 1814 and forced Napoleon to abdicate, one of the very first acts of the new government was to abolish the continental system. The decrees were torn down. The customs officers were dismissed or told to stop searching for British labels. The ports were thrown open. Contemporary accounts describe the scene in the ports of France. British ships sailed in for the first time in years. They were greeted with cheers. Merchants rushed to buy coffee and sugar and cotton. The prices of these goods dropped overnight. It was a moment of sheer relief for the common people who had spent years drinking chicory instead of coffee and wearing rags instead of cotton. The legacy of the continental system is profound. It was a failure, but it was a failure that changed the world. It proved that in the modern era, economic power is as important as military power. Napoleon was a military genius. He won almost every battle he fought, but he lost the war because he could not understand the invisible forces of the market. He tried to command the economy like he commanded a regiment of cavalry, and he found that the economy does not obey orders. You cannot court-martial a supply and demand curve. The system also had unintended consequences that shaped the future. Because Europe was cut off from British manufactured goods, industries on the continent were forced to innovate. The beet sugar industry is the most famous example. Before the blockade, all sugar came from sugarcane, grown in the tropics. When the British Navy cut off the supply, French scientists figured out how to extract sugar from beets grown in European soil. It was a massive technological breakthrough that is still with us today. Similarly, the textile industries in places like Saxony and Alsace developed rapidly because they had a captive market protected.
Yeah, so it is also the British blockade of of Napoleon. Okay, was the same thing even with America. When America put all these sanctions on these different nations, it created a sanctioned economy, and it created an economy to where these nations now have an economy that these sanctions don't hurt them like they used to. You see, now, all right, these nations, China, Russia, and Iran mainly, okay, other different nations as well, North Korea, because they've been sanctioned so much by America, all right, that they've had to trade in alternative means, and it has created what you call the sanctioned economy, okay, and now the American sanctions, okay, have made these nations form an economic alliance, and now it's a military alliance, okay, that's going to war against America, man. Okay, it has become a military powerhouse, all right, that's in opposition to America, man, and is whooping America ass as we speak, So let's go from there. Let's get a few more precepts, all right. Let's get a few more precepts. Okay, when you go to let's go here to show you just the history of Esau, man. Esau does the same thing every time. All right, so let's go here to the book of Maccabees, chapter 1, in verse 1. It says, "And it happened that after Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Shittim, had smitten, all right, Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece." So now it's the Greek Empire. All right, this is when Esau will become a superpower in the earth. Okay, it says, "And made many wars and won many strongholds and slew the kings of the earth and went through to the ends of the earth and took spoils of many nations, insomuch that the earth was quiet before him, whereupon he was exalted and his heart was lifted up." And there go their pride. Okay, so this man spoiled the earth, took down, this great Persian empire. Okay, had nations in tribute to him. And what did he do? He became proud. Okay, that's what these devils do every time. Pride and ambition. And if the Lord didn't put Alexander to death, he wasn't going to stop. And it says, "He gathered a mighty strong host and ruled over countries and nations and kings who became tributaries unto him. And after this, he fell sick and perceived that he should die." Okay, so he died, in a short span, because he went on like a 12-year conquest, conquering, the known world, and the kingdoms of the earth, most of the known world and the kingdoms of the earth he began to conquer. Okay, and they were subjugated unto him. It says, "Wherefore he called his servants, such as were honorable and had been brought up with him from his youth, and parted his kingdom among them while he was yet alive." Okay, and this is going into, all right, these generals, all right, Ptolemy, Seleucid, Cassander, and Lysimachus. Okay, and they split his kingdom when he died. Okay, and it says, "So Alexander reigned 12 years and then died, and his servants bare rule every one in his place." Okay, So you had the different Edomites, all right, these generals, they split his kingdom up in 4 ways. Okay, not to get real deep into that, but we done plenty of lessons upon it. Now, just show you the mindset of these devils. Okay, it says, now when the kingdom was established before Antiochus, he thought to reign over Egypt that he might have the dominion of 2 realms. Okay, so here it is. All right, one of these generals, okay, which would create the Seleucid Empire. All right, and you will have, Antiochus, all right, Epiphanes, okay, that will come, from the Seleucid Empire. Here it is. His kingdom is established. He got his own kingdom, but he just want to reign over the kingdom of Egypt, which was ran by the Ptolemaic dynasty. All right, he just want to reign over Egypt just cause. Not that he was hurting for anything, but nigga just cause. Okay, this is how these devils operate. They look at each other. They remember, this is the top government in the earth, the Greek Empire. So Esau's at the top of the hill. The kingdoms of the earth, the nations of the earth are subjugated and tributary to the Greeks. Okay, so what do these devils do every time they get to this point? They turn on each other. Okay, they do it every time. Okay, the Romans did the same thing. Look at Roman civil wars. These niggas do the same thing every time. When Rome was the top government in the earth, that's when you started having Roman civil wars amongst one another. It's all right. It says he thought to reign over Egypt that he might have dominion, okay, of 2 realms. Okay, wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many, all right, were wounded to death. Thus they got strong cities in the land of Egypt and took the spoils thereof. Okay, so he went and spoiled Egypt. Okay, he can never be satisfied. Okay, and not only that, after he spoiled Egypt, because we're gonna go into a map, all right, because we was caught up in the middle, or what they call the Syrian Wars. You can look that up, the Syrian Wars between the Ptolemaic dynasty, all right, and the Seleucid dynasty. Okay, and it says, and after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude. So on the way back, okay, from spoiling the Egyptian empire, going to war with the Ptolemaic empire in Egypt, okay, on the way back, he stopped through Jerusalem and spoiled Jerusalem. Okay, it says, and entered proudly into the sanctuary and took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and all these vessels thereof, and the table of showbread and pouring vessels and vials and the censers of gold and the veil and the crown and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver, all right, and the gold and the precious vessels. Also he took the hidden treasures, all right, which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having had a great massacre and spoken very proudly, man. Okay, he can never be satisfied. Okay, and I want to just take a look at, all right, the map. Okay, just look at the map real quick to show you the greed of this nigga. Now, when you look at the map, all right, let's see. Mike can see if I can blow it up a little bit. Right. So when you look at the map, all right, you see the Seleucid Empire right here in the yellow. It's far bigger than all the other kingdoms, okay, of the Greek Empire. All right, you see the kingdom of Cassander, kingdom of Lysimachus, all right, the Ptolemies. And the Seleucid had this big, huge empire, okay, but he can never be satisfied. All right, and you see right here in the red, with this little speck, okay, the yellow. This is Israel, and we was caught in the middle of these two Edomites warring one another. You know, every time the Ptolemies would invade, all right, the Seleucid Empire, they had to pass through Jerusalem. Now the Ptolemies were a little more friendly to Jake. You know, that's why you had a lot of Jake in Alexandria, Egypt. You know, the Ptolemies were tolerant with Jake, you know, practicing, you know, their customs. You know, that's why even during the time of Yahushua, during the Roman Empire, okay, they fled into Egypt, you know, to get out of the, you know, they were fleeing from Herod, you know, and Joseph and Mary, they took Yahushua to Alexander amongst, you know, other Jews, okay, in Alexander, all right. They were still keeping the custom, you know, they were still, you know, being able to keep the law and be Israelites, okay. But Seleucia was a very, all right, tyrannical, wicked nigga, man, okay. But just to show you the greed of these niggas, man, all right, he can never be satisfied, man, okay. And America is moving on this same time, all right, and it's going to collapse. Okay, and ultimately it's going to bring in the collapse of all these heathen nations, man. Okay, with America, we're going to see the American collapse first. All right, and then immediately after America, man. Okay, Yahushua is going to come and conquer all these heathens, man. Okay, so let's mhm. You know, so these devils, you know, continue to fight, okay, over their own empire, where Yahushua just coming to lay everything down, okay, and conquer the earth in righteousness. You see? So let's go here. We end it here. This is the book of Revelation, chapter 11, and verse 14. It says, the second woe was past, and behold, the third woe coming quickly. Okay? So the second woe was past, and the third woe coming quickly. It's Third World War, because the Second World War has already been. So now we're in the midst of the beginning of a Third World War. Okay? And it's going to be what? These devils fighting over this new system. Okay? Fighting over who's going to have control over the technocracy, man. Okay? It says, and the seven angels sounded, and there was great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his anointed, and he shall reign forever and ever. Okay? And we're going to rule in harmony as a people. You know, we're going to rule in harmony. All right? You're not going to have brothers jealous over other brothers and what they got going on. No, man, we're going to complement each other, man, under Yahushua, okay, in rulership, man. All right, that's the heathen. You see, that's how they do it. That's why Yahushua said, look, we're not going to be like the Gentiles, these heathens, when we get in power, man. Okay, as a leader, you should serve your people. Your rulership should serve your people. Okay, it should benefit the people that you're ruling over, man. Okay. And that's how it's going to be in our kingdom. And the heads of Israel, their rulership is going to benefit the rest of Israel. Okay. And eventually it's going to benefit the rest of the earth after a 1,000-year period, man. So that's the point. You know, just wanted to get into that. You know, thought that history would be good to go into. All right. Dealing with what we see happening now. You know, so Lord will, you brothers. All right. And you sisters edified once again. We'll give all praise and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahushua, Bahashem, Rakakodash, and double honors unto the apostles and the elders of GMS who rule well, teach well, being great examples to us young brothers. And peace and blessings, salutations to the hopeful, like Shalom.